All right, we're going to start period 6, which is 1865 to 1898. It's also known as the Gilded Age. The main focus of this time period is industrialization and the rise of corporations, immigration, urbanization, cultural change. We're going to be looking at and then we're looking at the views of, especially income disparity with social Darwinism, gospel of wealth, and debates over economic policy. I think one thing as we move into this time period is Mark Twain is the one who called it the Gilded Age. And gilded is with an I, not with a UI, not like the Lollipop Guild or like the Guild of Wizards or something. It's gilded, like covered in gold. And it doesn't mean it's actually golden. So if I have a gilded candelabra, it is like a brass candelabra which is covered in gold. If you scratch the surface, it is just like gold that is covering something else. So in this idea, the Gilded Age is it's like it looks like prosperity, it looks like progress, but it's overlaying a lot of poverty, racism, corruption. I think today we would even put in environmental disasters and financial instability. So I don't know why I repeated. This one is going to be the first lecture, and we're looking at the West first. And so I think one way to look at the West is different depending on who you are and what you want. There's conflicting visions of the West, especially if you are Native American. You are not, this is not a matter of like progress or Western migration. This is you defending your land against an Eastern invader. There are ranchers versus farmers. A lot of times people are like, what are the difference between a rancher and a farmer? Well, a rancher has usually cattle, and you just let them kind of roam the earth. You're going to brand them, you're going to let them kind of eat off of the land, and then you round them up at the end. Farmers grow their own food. They invest more in the land, and yeah. So individuals versus corporations, minorities versus white supremacy, immigrants and nativists, right? And all throughout this, there is a lot of government intervention in the West. And an example of this government intervention is the Pacific Railway Act of 1862. So the Pacific Railway Act, this is passed during the Civil War, and I can't emphasize that enough. So the U.S. government in the middle of the Civil War does not have a lot of money to spend, but it still wants to invest in transcontinental railroads. This is one of the things the Republicans sort of like the Whigs before them and then like the Federalists before them. They want to invest in internal improvements. They want to invest in the United States to try to get it to be a more capitalist nation. And so the Republicans, even in the midst of the Civil War, want to invest in these internal improvements. They don't have a lot of money, but they do have a lot of land that they got in that Texas Revolution. The Mexican annexation. And so what they decide to do is give land as incentives. So they said, if you lay 1 mile of track, I will give you 10 square miles of land. So these land incentives are going to get private corporations to build the railroads. Again, this is not the government building the railroad. This is the government giving a land incentive so that private corporations will build the railroads. And the two corporations are going to be the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads. Now, while this is very quick, it is amazing how quickly the Transcontinental Railroad is built. It is not the most efficient. It is not the best way to get there. It's kind of roundabout. So there are tons of examples of the Central Pacific or the Union Pacific sort of jutting around so that they can get extra land, because there's not an incentive to be the shortest route between two places. The other thing is they're going to hire a lot of immigrants, and where they're going to get immigrants from depends on where they start. So, starting from the Pacific out here, right, people are actually come from China to work the railroads. And then this is the original Transcontinental Railroad, right? It comes this way. They meet in Promontory Point, Utah. And then the other one comes from this way. And, starting from essentially over here is where they're heading to, Chicago. So they meet, they unite the nation. This is the thing. And look at how much land is handed out. So every time they are building, they are getting 10 square miles on either side. And it's not just the original Transcontinental Railroad. The U.S. continues giving out land grants beyond just the first Transcontinental Railroad. So the impact of railroads is it's going to cut travel time from 6 months to 1 week to reach the West Coast. This is going to increase migration and exchange of ideas. You could have a pamphlet that's printed in New York and it could make it all the way to California. I think the other thing is it's going to create national unity. We used to have actual like local time zones, which were based on like a local clock. Now, this was not going to work with the railroads, and the railroad companies, not the government, but the railroad companies are the ones who set down things like time zones. It's going to create a more coordinated effort and create more standardization. The other thing is increased destruction of an environment and resource depletion. We're going to take a look at the bison. We looked at like in one of the videos, but we'll also look at it here. But even things like, water, lumber, these sort of things, because we are also going to have these large-scale corporations and large-scale consumption. So this, like, raw materials can be brought in from anywhere. In corporations can have, these huge industry-sized production, and then they could spread their goods out to the entire nation in what's called like a national market. So like an example would be like Tabasco. Tabasco is over in Avery Island, and they were around before, the Transcontinental Railroad, but their market was essentially New Orleans and the Gulf Coast, right? But their target market was like New Orleans. Now, once we get this Transcontinental Railroad, their market is no longer just New Orleans. Their market is the United States. And because they have railroads, they can bring in glass bottles from, somewhere and have a standard, production. They can bring in vinegar from somewhere. They can bring in all the different resources. If you think of any major, like your favorite brands, most of them are created between like 1860 and 1890 because it is when we have this first integrated market where you can bring in raw materials, you can make these mass economies of scale, and then you can make an advertisement, and then you can have everybody in America eating Heinz ketchup. You can have everyone in America eating Tabasco sauce. You can have everyone in America eating, I don't know, these crackers, right? So we are going to be unifying the nation in that way as well. It's like integrated market, large-scale corporations. An example would be something like, another impact on the railroads, specifically on the West, is with cattle ranchers, right? So if I was a cow down here, we'll give him a little horn, maybe a tail, right? If I'm a bunch of cattle down here owned by a rancher, and remember, a rancher, you're just wandering the earth, you're eating whatever is around on the grasslands, and you're fat enough, you're big enough, it's time for you to go to slaughter. Well, we're not taking you to a local slaughterhouse. Where are the slaughterhouses? They are actually in Chicago. Starting with the Civil War, but then even after, we are making meat packing plants in Chicago. Well, how are we going to get the cow from Texas to the train so that they can then go to Chicago? Who is going to take the cattle from Texas to Chicago to these trains to like Dodge City so they can get on a train and go to Chicago? Those people are going to be the cowboys. So cowboys, actually, their job was just to take the cattle, usually in Texas, to the train to places like Dodge City. They would, drive these cattle. They would be out in the range for, a month at a time or something. And then when they would get to the railhead, they would, get their paycheck, and then they would, have fun in Dodge City, I guess. I think the other thing about cowboys is they're very diverse. The very first cowboys were actually vaqueros. The kind of tradition of ranching comes from rancheros and, vaqueros, which is like cowboys. So these practices actually come from Mexico originally. But then also you're going to have African-American cowboys who are coming from newly freed people in the South. And so, this like 1950s image of the white cowboys, not quite what it actually was at the time. It was a very diverse group of people. And so, when we're talking about integrated markets, before, if we wanted to buy meat, we would go to our local butcher, right? It would be a skilled butcher, right? he would have to learn how to like carve up the, animal and do all that. So, but now we're going to have these trains coming in from Texas, right? Or actually not from Texas. They'd be coming in from, Oklahoma with the cattle on them. They're going to dump the cattle in here, right, into what's called the stockyard, right? And so then you're going to have stockyard, and then you're going to go into the slaughterhouse, where essentially you'd have the cow and you just like chop them up, all right? Let's just chop them up. Now, as it's going down the ascender, they would actually have a hook, and they would put the cow on it. Oh, he's very sad because he's dead, all right? And then they would just chop him up, all right? And then he would go down the assembly line as different people are chopping different parts off. So that would be the slaughterhouse. And then you would go to the lard refinery, where they're going to take the parts that aren't used for, cuts of meat and like boil it down into lard. Oil, pepsin is from like the pig, where you would actually take like the different parts of their like pituitary glands to make things. Fertilizer, you would, ground down the bone. You would make, you're getting it, right? Glue. You are using every single part of the animal. The famous quote is that they used everything on the pig but the squeal, because you can't do that. Anyway, this is what I like to call a disassembly plant. Ford gets all the credit for, the assembly plant, but these guys took an animal, and by the end of it, nothing was left. It was taken apart piece by piece. These are not skilled labor. This is unskilled labor, where all day one person would do one thing. So this like meat packing, this is an example of these like, huge economies of scale. These guys are going to bring in this beef, and now Americans are buying Swift meat. They are buying Swift canned sausages. They are buying Swift, whatever, all of these different things. They are not going to their local skilled butcher. So this is a thing. And they owned everything from the refrigerated car line to everything else. So what's going to happen to the Cowboys is they don't have to stay around for very long, right? So originally the Cowboys would take the cows from here, right? Again, here's my cow, poor guy, right? And then they would take them to what's called the railhead, right? And then it would go to Chicago. But what's going to happen, right? This is in 1870. By 1890, right, the train is going down into Texas. So I don't need to take the cows to the railheads, or the, where the end of the railroad is. Now the train is in Texas. So Cowboys essentially go away as people who are like taking the cattle through the range. So the West, by 1890, there's no more Cowboys. The other people who are moving to the West are farmers or homesteaders, and the government encourages migration west through the Homestead Act. And this is a very tough life. These are, right, there's very few resources out here. There's very little water. So even though this land is free, it is hard to work it. It is hard to survive, and you need a lot of investment in order to make it work. If you were to put me in hell, I don't think that's swearing. Is that swearing? I'm sorry if you think it's swearing. This would be it. Is this woman, right? What is in her wheelbarrow is buffalo chips, right? If you look out in this land, there are very few trees. There's just this few shrubby trees. So what are you going to burn for fire to keep warm in the cold winters? What are you going to burn, right? What are you going to build your house out of? Well, you are going to use these buffalo chips, which is dried up buffalo poop. Right? So this is what she's collecting for everything, right? For heating, for building, for everything. Because there's no other resource that's out there. And so there's very few resources. You're going to be dependent on corporations to bring you lumber, to get you barbed wire. You're going to have irrigation, right? So these folks who are moving out west are going into debt to try to make this land farmable and livable. All right? Okay. Buffalo chips. Ugh. And the other thing that is going to enclose the West is barbed wire. So ranchers used to just let their cattle kind of roam around. The thing is, you'd get in these ranch wars where if I found out that somebody else was like letting their cattle graze on my land, I'd have to go and like shoot them or something. But now with barbed wire, I could enclose my land. But what this does is it makes it so that there's no longer any open range. Also, farmers would use barbed wire for their animals, or also to keep other animals out. This barbed wire takes money, so it's also another thing that corporations are making money on and would put farmers into debt. But barbed wire is an important invention that encloses the West. The other activity that's going on in West is mining. I think most famously we have like the 49ers, right? In 1849, they find gold in Sutter's Mill, right? And so you have people flooding into California in 1849 to find this gold. But what happens slowly afterwards is they find gold in other places. They find silver and gold in Nevada over time. They're going to find gold up here in Idaho. And they're going to keep like kind of moving and finding it as they go along. This right here, this is when we get into the Lakota. They find gold in the Black Hills. This is going to be one of the problems that's going to happen for the Native Americans. But silver and gold is coming in massive amounts in the United States after 1849. And we think about like these like mining prospectors, like I found gold. But really, who is finding the gold, who is making money is corporations. You can't really have a mine without, rail cars and drills and pumps and diggers and all this other stuff. And so once people found gold or silver, these mining corporations would come in, create these mining boom towns, and miners would become just, employees of these mining corporations. Some of the people who are working in the mines and on the railroad are going to be, most of them are immigrants. 25 to 50% of camp citizens are foreign born. Chinese are encouraged to come early on to work in the mines and in the railroads. The U.S. government wants them to come because it is actually faster to get people to come from China before the Transcontinental Railroad. So I guess I'll just use this map because it's close. But before the Transcontinental Railroad, when it would take 6 months for people to get across the country, it'd be easier for people to come to China to work here than it would be to come from New York, right? And so originally, the United States, makes treaties with China to get people to come to the United States. But when they get to the United States, they are immediately hated. There's a lot of nativism, starting with like a mining tax and eventually leading to the Chinese Exclusion Act. We are going to look at this closer in another unit. The people who are really affected by this Western migration as well as Native Americans. So as people before in the 1830s were just sort of moving west, it wasn't as big of an issue for the Plains Indians. But now we have people, like usually a lot of these are over mining towns, but when they find gold in Idaho, they try to make this Bozeman Trail, right? And so this trail that people are trying to go up in here, right, to get to the gold, right? And so you have lots of people moving through Lakota hunting territory, moving through these regions, and then setting up. And so what happens is there are wars that are attacking these people on Bozeman Trail, and this is called Red Cloud's War. And essentially, this war is going to, there's going to be a treaty that's signed, and with the treaty, they basically say, right, in this Treaty of Fort Laramie, that you can, right, we want to have access up in here, I guess it was into Montana, right? We want to be able to go here. So what we're going to do in this treaty is you can have all of this land, right? As long as the, water runs and the grasses grow, this is all your land. Now, the problem is what's going to happen is they find gold. And in South Dakota, down in here. And so the Custer is actually going to be told to try to protect the gold that they find in South Dakota. And this is going to be when we have Custer's Last Stand or the Battle of Little Bighorn. So essentially Custer was trying to protect people who were mining for gold in places they shouldn't have been because of the Battle of Fort Laramie. He sees what he thinks is a village, so he looks at a bunch of teepees and he's like, oh, I bet that's I don't know, there's 100 teepees. I imagine there's 100, men, and probably the rest are women and children. He goes to attack the Sioux or Lakota, thinking that he was sneaking up on, a village. But what it actually was a hunting party. So each teepee was full of 6 young men, warriors, and they are going to defeat Custer hands down in what people call a massacre against Custer. It's Custer's last stand. And so Custer, this is a win for the Sioux, but essentially a war is going to develop, and the United States government is going to put their full resources to defeat the Plains Indians, and eventually the United States government is going to win. So the United States government, as they are fighting the Sioux, they are killing them off. Over time, they go from having what was essentially the Great Sioux Reservation was much more, right, was out here. Then they shrink it to here. And then over time, they're going to shrink it even further, right? So why do we have to have this large amount of land? Well, it's because of the bison. The bison would, wander as they're eating the grasses. They would keep migrating, right, to eat the grasses. And so you have to have a large amount of land to hunt the bison. And the bison was the main way that the Lakota Sioux live. So as the railroads are coming through, as the land is getting encroached on, they are shrinking the land down and down and down, and they are essentially forcing Native Americans onto these reservations. And the buffalo was the way of life. And so they need to have these massive amounts of land because they would hunt, right, along these lands. And so over time, and we're going to look at the buffalo as well, the government starts to, one, kill off the buffalo, which is the Native American way of life. And the other thing is that they're going to force Native Americans onto smaller reservations. The problem is they find gold in the Black Hills. So they renegotiate the treaty into what is called allotments. Actually, let me get to this. Allotments, which is tinier pieces of land. So they're killing off the cattle, they're killing off the buffalo, and the two reasons why they're killing off the buffalo is, one is if you kill the buffalo, you kill off the Indian way of life, right? And you can also make way for cattle. The problem is that when they replace the bison with cattle, you get a lot of overgrazing in the West because they don't migrate like the bison. So they kill off the cattle, and then they're also starting to kind of have forced assimilations for Native Americans. Before this kind of policy of assimilation, people kind of were just, engaging in Indian wars. They didn't really care. There was, just Native Americans were on the road to it was a genocide, essentially. The United States was engaging in genocide. And in the 1890s, progressives kind of looked at this and they were like, you know what? We should not kill off all the Native Americans. And there started to be a policy of kill the Indian, save the man, which is, why don't we try to get Native Americans to assimilate into American way of life? And that is how we are going to, solve what they call the Indian problem. So one of the ways they are going to try to do assimilation is by sending folks to boarding schools. They would take people off of the Great Plains and send them to schools in the East Coast to, become civilized. This is the same guy. This is him before, and this is him after. And so these boarding schools the most famous is the Carlisle boarding school. These boarding schools would use these photos as examples of their success of assimilation. These are terrible places, and we'll take a closer look at that as well in class. So the other thing that's going to happen as far as assimilation is we are going to take away tribal land ownership. So if you remember, we went from here, right? And then we're going to go to here. This is like the next phase of the Great Sioux Reservation because they wanted the Black Hills. It was still communal land ownership. And in 1887, they are going to sign the Dawes Severalty Act, which I guess I'll put in a different color. The Dawes Severalty Act, which then gives individual pieces of land to individual Native American families. So each Native American family is going to have 160 acres of land, right? No longer are you going to have communal or tribal land ownership, which is essentially the backbone of, Indian culture and their whole history. And once you do not have communal land, and once you don't have these lands, you're going to have, you're going to not be able to hunt the bison anymore. And you are forcing people onto farms to become right, assimilated into the American way of life. Now, the problem is, why have Native Americans not farmed from the beginning? Is because this land is terrible land to farm. And so as they are put onto these lands to farm, and their tribal lands are taken away and the buffalo have been killed, they are going to be turning into, they're going to become desperate. So this is where we're going to take a look at Wounded Knee. This is a Lakota Sioux. So remember, this was like the old one. I'm trying to get you guys another, like this is going to be the Pine Ridge Reservation right here. And so it is essentially like right here. Like this is what we're talking about, right? As they start to then just like corner off little areas of this. They steal the Black Hills for gold, and they put people on ever smaller things. And then even within this, each individual family is given just an allotment of land. You get 160 acres, and you get 160 acres, and you get 160 acres, right? No longer tribal land ownership. So as people are forced onto the land, onto the reservations, they're starving. They have very little options. Many people are turning to alcohol. They are dependent on a lot of government handouts on these reservations. A Northern Paiute spiritual leader, Wakova, starts to spread a message that if you practice a dance called the ghost dance, and we do this properly, and we wear these shirts, and we do all these things, we will bring the spirits back that'll fight on our behalf and fight this like Western expansion. Essentially, our ancestors will come back, and we are all going to force out white folks who have come in here. They believed that they wore these shirts, and they really, really believed that it would like resist, American bullets. They believed it would bring peace and prosperity. They believed the bison would come back. And so people believe that this is called a revitalization movement. And it's also like pan-Indian, like many different Indian groups are engaging in this dance. It's a circle dance. They're getting together. They are, kind of revitalizing their spirits. They are turning to this because they are desperate on these reservations. Now, in Pine Ridge, on the Lakota Reservation, this is called the Last Indian Battle, but really it's a massacre. So people are engaging in this dance. People on the reservation see this dance, and essentially they are like, okay, these guys are like whooping it up for war. We need to call in the army. And so as people see this like Sioux camp like dancing and engaging in the ghost dance, the army is called in, and they completely surround the encampment with this cavalry camp, and they have artillery, which is guns. So while you have women, children, men engaging in a dance, right, trying to kind of like regain their sense of like spiritual meaning and everything else, essentially there is a conflict, and the artillery just starts opening fire on this Sioux camp. People try to run away from the troops. They immediately start to run, but as they're running, they keep getting shot. And so most of the people who are who are shot, like here, they end up having to leave them. That's like right around Christmas. The whole thing is terrible. Many of them are shot in the back. Women are shot with like in the back with like still holding their children, right? And it is terrible. This is the last Indian battle. This is like, people consider it the last, and I want to kind of like talk about that in class. Is like, why do we look at this as the last thing that happened, right? As far as like Native American culture, and I really want to challenge that. So, but essentially after this, folks are on the reservation. There's very few conflicts after. But also, that's in 1890, but also in 1890, there is a census, and they decide that there is no longer a frontier in the U.S. history, right? You have to think the trains have enclosed the West. You have barbed wire enclosing the West. You have, Native Americans are essentially put onto the reservations. The West is no longer what the West has been throughout the history of the United States. Up until 1890, we have constantly been moving west as this like progression of manifest destiny. But now there is no longer a frontier. It is all essentially civilized. And Frederick Jackson Turner is a historian, and he looked at the impact of the frontier on U.S. history, and he really just thinks like the reason why Americans are Americans is because of this availability of like open land. What made Americans different than Europeans is that Americans came into this like wilderness, and then they became rugged individuals as they had to force themselves west. American democracy is actually built on Western migration. American democracy is built because of the frontier spirit. And so Frederick Jackson Turner starts to kind of like popularize this idea that the West and the frontier is an important aspect of who we are as Americans. And so as it starts to close, we are kind of also at the same time worried about what does this mean for our democracy if we no longer have a West, if we no longer have a frontier. All right, we're going to kind of look more at Native Americans in class, and I hope you guys have a good day. Bye.